by the Institute of Palestine Studies and is the outcome of a number of discussions between activists and academics from South Asia and the Arab world. Today is the second in a series of talks that began with Dr. Amrit Wilson exploring the relationship between Hindutva and Zionism. And the text of that talk will be published by the IPS and will hopefully also be available in Arabic. Today, I'm delighted that Professor Ather Zia will be talking on Israeli settler state, India, neocolonialism, and the case of Kashmir. Our next talk will be on Thursday, 31st January, 2023, at the same time, 6 p.m. Palestine time, by renowned activist Tariq Ali, who will be talking on the global implications of the India-Israel relationship. We are holding this talk while recognizing the intensification of Israeli attacks on Gaza and the continuing oppression of the Palestinian people. Our intention in this series of talks is to offer a basis for solidarity with those struggling for freedom and justice in the Arab and South Asian worlds. Whilst our first talk attracted a personal attack on me by the supporters of the Israeli settler colonial project, the necessity for voices to stand up to injustice is ever more pressing. And we hope that these talks are part of an opportunity to build networks of resisting peoples so that we can learn from each other's experiences. And today, I'm really delighted that we have a speaker who's produced some of the best academic and popular literature on the Kashmir struggle and resistance movement. Ather Zia is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist. I think to earn money, she's an associate professor at the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Colorado in the US. Ather is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which is an amazing book if you can get hold of it, which won the 2020 Gloria Anzaldua Honorable Mention Award, the Public Anthropologist Award, and Advocate of the Year 2021. She has been featured in the Femilist 2021, a list of 100 women from the Global South working on critical issues. She's the co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak? Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace. I'm really happy that Ather is also a poet, and she's published a poetry collection called The Frame, and another collection is forthcoming. In 2008 and 13, Ather's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir won an award for the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She's the founder editor of Kashmir Lit, and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary study network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Today, she will talk to us for about 20 minutes, which will be followed by a question and answer. Please put your questions in the chat box in Zoom if you're joining us in that way, or in the chat function on Facebook as we are going along. Also, if you can please share the Facebook link on your social media feeds, that would be really appreciated. I'd like to hand over to Ather.
Thank you so much, Professor Kalra. And thank you so much to the Palestinian Studies and also Professor Ali for inviting me for this talk. And I had prepared some remarks that were written remarks just in the interest of time, but I feel like the way we format it now, which is 15 to 20 minutes, and then we have Q&A, I'll just let go of the paper and just talk about my topic today, which is Israeli settler state, Indian neocolonialism, and the case of Kashmir. One of the earliest discussions that I was having with the organizers when we were talking about this panel today, this talk today, was, is India learning from Israel? And is this Israelification, or, you know, all those things that we think of when we think about the two parallel struggles of the Palestinian and Kashmiri people? So one of the things, and I know that the ground has already been laid by Professor Wilson with regards to the Zionism and thinking about Hindutva. So I don't really need to go there, but I did want to say at the outset that while we think of Kashmiris and the Kashmiri struggle, and when we think about the Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle, and both of them parallel, it does come across that there are a lot of similarities, because they are one of the, or the two of the oldest issues or disputes on the agenda of United Nations. But at the same time, there are a lot of differences which we need to keep in mind. And also to think about Israelification of Kashmir would not be doing justice to either of the two struggles. So I would, which is why I felt like that I have to really separate Israeli settler state and see what kind of learning India does, if at all, from the Israeli settler state, and what does Indian neocolonialism look like, and what is actually the case of Kashmir. So what this talk today does is tries to reiterate that India has its own brand of settler colonialism in Kashmir, and that's something that we need to consider. It's its own historical structure. And there is transference of technologies from Israel to India, and there's a lot of back and forth right now, and we know how friendly they have gotten over the last 50 years and how friendly they are now and how in sync with each other they are. That's very palpable through the technologies of punishment that are used on people. So we'll come to that later, but I just to talk about a little bit about Indian neocolonialism or Indian imperialism, so to speak. We don't have to go too far. We have a very recent example of what happened in Kashmir in 2019, even though the thing that happened in 2019 in Kashmir was not something new. So just to go back to the event in 2019, August 5, what happened was that India unilaterally and militarily took away Kashmir's autonomy. And when we think about Kashmir's autonomy, what did that look like? That needs to be reiterated a little bit. That looked like it was sort of a negotiation that had been done by client politicians of Kashmir in 1947. With the Indian politicians, and they had negotiated this status for Kashmir, which was a semi-autonomous status for the region, where they would have control over some of the things. India would have control over some of the things, which was communication, currency, and foreign affairs. Of course, defense is kind of like implicit in all of that. And then Kashmiris would take care of the local governance, and they would take care of everything else that came under administering the territory. So that was kind of a truce that they had come to in 1947, and it came into effect in 1949. And after that, and part of that was also that there is going to be a plebiscite under the United Nations mandate, and the plebiscite would decide whether Kashmiris wanted to go with Pakistan or they would want to go with India. And implicit in all of that is that Kashmiris also want to be independent, which was not part of what the fleeing colonists had left as one of the resolutions, but it was, again, thinking about these larger democracies that Kashmiris had to join the larger nation states. But Kashmiris were, even in that point in time, for independence and still are for independence. And that is one of the key issues that Kashmiris are fighting for as their resistance continues in different phases and different forms. So 2019 was kind of this watershed mark in Kashmir's history in a different way, which was it became re-internationalized. And the reason I say it's re-internationalized was because from 1989, what India had done, what India had told the rest of the world was that there was this arms struggle that started in 1989 because democracy had failed in Kashmir. And there's a lot of invisibilization that happens with all of those narratives that have been thrown around and that the world has also bought and sold as well. So one of the things that thinking about democracy in Kashmir, democracy never existed in Kashmir. And I also have problems with a democracy per se, but that's a separate thing altogether. But democracy, as we know, people, by the people, for the people, of the people, that kind of a government, that never existed in Kashmir because Kashmir is a disputed territory. You cannot have elections in a disputed territory. And that is what the United Nations told India in 1950s when it held one of its first elections, that this is an out of order situation and the case is sub judice. Because remember, both Palestine and Kashmir were on UN agenda as disputed territories, which needed a resolve. So the election that was held first and foremost was never it was never a legal way of governing Kashmir. But then occupied territories also need to be governed, so it could be kind of seen under that rubric. But India took that as something that laid a foundation of what it calls a democracy, but it's a weaponization of democratic politics, basically. It's a weaponization of tools of democracy, and one of them is the electoral system. So it put that in place, and then you had client politicians that fell in place and who would run along with that infrastructure that was created around the quote-unquote democracy. So that's what we see happening from 1950s onwards. They set into motion this politics of democracy, which till very recently has been very easy for the rest of the international community to kind of run with and to understand Kashmir through. But it's not a lens that Kashmiris look at it from. It's a completely imposed lens. So a lot of people, they collate that when elections are happening in a place, democracy is also in place. And I think that's something that has created layers of invisibility around Kashmir for the last 74 years, so to speak. And of course, we also see something similar happening in the Palestinian territories as well, occupied territories as well. So that's kind of a little bit about thinking about Indian neocolonialism, like how do we see it? How does it hide within what the world sees as a democracy? Because both Israel and India profess to be these largest democracies. That's what Modi said to the Prime Minister of Israel very recently, that they are the largest democracies in their own regions, so to speak. And I think that needs to be considered. What do we see as a democracy? Like when you see an occupation, a full-fledged occupation where people are repressed. If we think about Kashmir in this moment, everything has been criminalized, even breathing as a Kashmiri identity has been criminalized. And I think both Palestine and Kashmiris, they are fighting for the right to exist, basically call themselves who they are under these the camouflages that the quote-unquote democracies have created around them and their issues. So 2019, what does 2019 tell us about the neocolonialism in Kashmir? And what does it also say about the post-colonial school of thought? And what does it say about post-coloniality or the post-colonial thought that has been used as a lens to understand India, and that has also been used as a lens to understand other non-Western cultures? I think it's very important for us in this moment to understand that post-colonialism has done much violence to issues like Kashmir and a Palestinian issue because they don't really exist. In context of Kashmir, if you look at post-colonial literature that kind of thinks about India and that has the subaltern school of thought, till very recently, no one even talked about Kashmir. And Kashmir has been an issue for the last 74 years from the creation of India and Pakistan, but also an issue before that. How does it get so invisibilized and no one asks a question about how is it that Kashmiris are still restive and resisting under what has been created, the superstructure around them of a nation state that calls itself a democracy? How is it that 70,000 plus people can be killed, both combatants and non-combatants? And you can have laws in place that criminalize a small assembly from 4 people to the bigger assemblies, whatever people can have, to protests. How can a media be criminalized to such an extent that today Kashmiri journalists are not able to write as freely as any press should be writing about? How is it that you can have Israeli, the innovative, whatever the kind of surveillance technologies that they are creating, which India is buying and using very easily, Pegasus very recently, how is it that it can be found on the phones and the electronic devices of journalists and other opinion leaders? And this violation of privacy that happens. And when I say violation of privacy, it's an irony, because in Kashmir there is no privacy. Just like when we think about Palestine, people in these repressed and these occupied territories, these indigenous people who are dispossessed, they have no right to privacy because their lives are between checkpoints, between bunkers, between crackdowns, and that is actively happening inside Kashmir at this moment, while India is tom-tomming democracy. And I think the issue of democracy and the discomfort that we have with the kind of democracy that is imposed, whatever you want to call it, illiberal, progressive, or whatever you want to call it. But I think inherently we have to think about, what does democracy mean for us in the non-West? And the reason I kind of also think about non-West is also thinking about indigenous people who are under siege at this moment, and that solidarity that we need regarding the superstructure of democracy that has been created and has been imposed on people, and that we are buying and defending in our own zones. And, for a Kashmiri, a long time back, someone told me that to not vote is my right. And that made me think of what we think about these democratic systems, that they're not democracy for us. It depends whether it's a democracy or not. It depends on which vantage you're looking at it from. And that also makes me think about the United States as a settler state. We have completely forgotten that United States is the mother settler state. And then we think about the Israeli settler state and how that Eurocentric democracy is also kind of making foray into, and Eurocentric democracy is not a kind structure. It's a kind structure to the ones that it is settling. It's not a kind structure to ones that it is imposing upon. And that's the irony of me also being here in United States, in a settler state, being part of a settler horde, being part of a set of a settler scholarship as well, that is looking at its own dispossession back in Kashmir. So that's an irony there that we have to think about. And that also makes me think about post-colonialism a lot, because I feel like in this moment, we have to think about the way the school of post-colonial thought has been deployed and who it has served and who it has invisibilized. And I think it has invisibilized Kashmiris as much it has invisibilized Palestinians. And the struggles don't look genuine anymore. They look like they are very easy to be diluted and bought as quote unquote Muslim terrorism, Islamic terrorism, or what have you. And that has become so sought after 9/11 as well. So I think that's where I will end. I don't know if I was able to talk about everything that I needed to, but it's already 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. But I'll take questions, and I think most of those things that might still be a little hazy and that I haven't touched upon will be talked about in the Q&A. And I think that's where I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Ather. Yeah, we've got two questions already. I don't know if you can see them in the chat box, but otherwise I'll read them. So this is a question via email from Shafaq Hussain. And I mean, this is quite a specific question around the British government, actually. It's saying, how can Kashmiris make the British government accountable for not fulfilling its duty under the Indian Independence Act to the Kashmiris for self-rule, as was done for Pakistan and India?
So there's two ways that I can answer this question. One is to get bogged down by history and go back into the nitty-gritty of history. And the other is really asking ourselves this question in this quote unquote post-colonial moment is, do we really need the kind of solutions and resolutions that the fleeing colonials left us? I mean, when Kashmir was being sort of like, for some time, Kashmir was completely independent. It was under the ruling monarch at that time. From, let's say, August 15 to October 27. So Kashmir was independent under its own king, still thinking what to do. And in the west part of Kashmir, there was already an uprising that had started that has been narrativized as kind of as a fight against not just the monarch, but against India as well, like against what was happening in that time. It's not narrativized as a rebellion. It's not as a rebellion and a revolution. It's not narrativized like that. It's narrativized as if it was happening, something very untoward was happening, that these people just got into this uprising and they were restive and they were fighting against the monarch. And it was kind of this Islamic, it had this as the stereotypically used. I'm not using the word as it's stereotypically used, but just for the sake of how it's deployed, as it had a jihadi element, it had this and that. So it wasn't really narrativized as people in West Kashmir being, there were these 50,000 fighters who had fought in World War, and they had gone back. They knew how to use arms and ammunition, and they wanted to free this land. They wanted to free their land. So there's a rebellion and a revolution rising from there, and working against the Maharaja, who later flees. And when the British, they're already stepped in, Indian politicians have already stepped in 10 years back into diplomacy with Kashmiris, and who later became their client politicians. So when you see this region in that moment, you don't really see anyone narrativizing that Kashmiris had actually risen up in rebellion to free their land, which what became Azad Kashmir. And that also has been narrativized as if something has been taken away from India. But we have to ask ourselves this question, like, who are we answering to this in this moment? Do we still have to go back to these late 19th, early 20th century resolutions that this fleeing colonists are leaving us with? And then we kind of like want to stick by them. There's not even there's not even a resolution for independence of Kashmir. It doesn't even exist in that. And that's how Kashmir resistance many times is completely undermined, that you either have to join Pakistan or you have to join India, and that's all there is in it for you. So do we really want to go back into what the Independence Act was? I'm not saying that we don't have to, I'm just thinking through the lens of like, do we really need to? There's so much has happened. We are reaching a point where we're really like just looking at the environment. Borders are becoming completely irrelevant. That big countries are becoming completely irrelevant, and we don't know what the future holds. So do we really want to go back and say, hey, we were legitimate? And are these really? How do we consider the British government at that time, which was for all practical purposes, a colonial government, a legitimate government, and that we have to abide by? I feel like these are questions we have to ask, and I think Critical Kashmir scholars in the last 15 to 20 years, they have produced so much work around thinking of the contestations of what they have been asking, what is legal and what is not. Because, if you think about the Indian rule right now in Kashmir, they've always been thinking about the other side, the Azad Kashmir, which I think was liberated for Kashmiris, but that's not how it's narrativized. That's liberated Kashmir. That's why it is Azad Kashmir. The name kind of tells you about the history. And Kashmir is such a region where vocabulary, the way you're using names, the way you're deploying names, it becomes very important because you're also kind of tracing the history. So India also claims that. And under whose behest? Like, should we be kind of going back and looking at the nitty-gritty of the technicalities that the colonial government had left behind, or should we be thinking of what is happening now, making decisions that are environmentally sane, that fit the people in the region, and that are also futurist? Because we are looking too much into a past that we should not be considering, because it hasn't really served the region. Even thinking about the very benign, like, when we think about post-colonialism, we think about Ather Zia, we think about, Orientalism, and we think about all the wonderful things that it revealed. But just think about how much it has invisibilized for us people, for Palestinians, for Kashmiris. So how do we rethink this moment? So while I respect that we should read history, our own histories, the history of the underdogs, which is not there, no one really has narrativized Kashmir or the history of Azad Kashmir the way it should be. Even in Kashmir, many people, the violence of language is so imposed because the government that you're living under, the occupation that you're living under. For a long time, Kashmiris kind of only saw the Kabaili raid. That's how they saw it. They called it a Kabaili raid, completely unseeing the violence that Indian army had caused during that very time on their populations, completely unseeing, because the narrative for the next 40 years became that this was a raid and that was saving of the people. So I think while we have to go back to thinking about the Independence Act and thinking about what kind of resolutions were left by Lord Mountbatten and all of those people, I also think that this is a moment that we can actually divest of all of that baggage and really think in decolonial terms about the future of these regions. And by that, I don't mean to say that we have to completely forego United Nations and all of that. Those are elements that we really need to keep in mind because the world understands through that lens. While we are doing that, we also have to do a lot of decolonization of our own mindset and decolonization of the knowledges that we're using.
Thanks, Ather. The second question is from Satak Tomer, who asks a practical question, actually. What actions and activities can Indians do that would more positively contribute to the Kashmir struggle against Indian neocolonialism? So
I think, in India, I would say per se, there is a lot of sanctioned ignorance, and that's not my term. It's Gayatri Spivak's term, and we keep borrowing from post-colonial scholars, or even if they don't call themselves post-colonial scholars or subaltern scholars anymore. But I think there is, for the longest possible time, there has been this sanctioned ignorance around Kashmir in India, especially. And when I say sanctioned ignorance, what it means is that there are certain forms of knowledges that are considered to be bona fide, that are considered to be good and benign, and other people's histories are completely erased. And those are, for example, this very example, like, why is there so much resistance in Kashmir? Why do Kashmiris not see themselves as quote unquote Indians? Why do even the client politicians who have done such disservice to Kashmir that they have brought it to the brink of annihilation in this moment, they even did not see themselves as full-fledged Indians. They saw themselves as adhering to Indian constitutions, but they didn't see themselves as Indians. That's why they actually created what was also known to other people as subnationalism, but I don't really see that as subnationalism as much as I see it as an identity. And again, nationalism is completely a different thing altogether, and that's a separate discussion. So in this moment, what can Indians do? They can really come out of this sanctioned ignorance, which is also sinking their country. And that sanctioned ignorance is that Kashmir is not an integral part of India. Kashmir is a separate part where Kashmiris, from the very get-go, have seen plebiscite as a way out, but plebiscite is again very limiting. They have seen the right to self-determination as a way out, which is more and more. It's a bigger. It has a bigger audience, I would say. And also connecting to Kashmiri history. For the last 74 years, India really has been able to tell the rest of the world that they are imposing democracy in Kashmir. How do you impose democracy on people who are not adhering to your constitution, who are clearly saying that they are separate? How is it that the impositions from 1947 onwards, everything that has happened to Kashmiris has been dilution and criminalization of their resistance? And that has happened because it's been easy for Indian masses, I would say, to buy the fact that India is a country where there is unity in diversity. And they have also bought into this idea of nationalism, that we are one from, as they say, Kashmir to Kanyakumari, but that's not really true. And it's a malaise of nationalism. And that has to be countered. And that doesn't mean that you love what is now your country less, but that also means that you respect other people's identities and ethnicities. And Kashmiris have, for even if you think geographically, these have been really distinct people, and they have a distinct pride. If you have a distinct pride, these people also have a distinct pride. Why is it that the malaise of nationalism has to supersede everything? And that happens because Kashmir's history has been invisibilized completely. Kashmiris are seen as criminals. Right from 1947, even their earliest client politician, who actually created a bridge between India and Kashmir, which became the special status, he was criminalized within several months of signing the document of the Article 370. He was part of that. And once that was done, it was done and dusted. They were treated as, sorry to use a very impolite analogy, they were used as they were used as just like you use toilet paper. And he was thrown into jail and political wilderness for the next 25 years. He was used because he had actually helped India come into Kashmir through its own legal statutes. And that was the Article 370. It was a Trojan horse for Kashmiris. It basically held all those laws, especially the Fundamental Rights Charter of Indian Constitution, which also can put people under administrative detention if India's sovereignty is threatened. So once that came in, slowly and steadily, Kashmir's own struggle became criminalized. Today, you can easily call Kashmiris as terrorists without understanding that most Kashmiris adhere to that line of thought. Today, Kashmiri people cannot even speak about, if they write even a small Facebook post, they get arrested. If they write an article, they are thrown out of there was a Ph.D. student very recently. He'd written an article in 2010, which suddenly it was deemed as threatening India's sovereignty, and he's in jail currently. Human rights defenders, everyone else. How is it possible that a democracy can accept people being incarcerated and killed in such a manner? Isn't that a question to ask? Isn't there some kind of lacunae that is present in the minds of Indian masses, some kind of invisibilization that has happened? It's very easy to buy that Kashmiris are violent, Kashmiris are they're terrorists because they're also Muslims, because you conflate those two and it becomes very easy. How is it that it's so easy to buy it? And I think one of the greatest services that people who think inside India and are still willing to understand, I think they should contend with what Kashmiris have written in the last 74 years. Not just what your own analysts have told you, but Kashmiris have written. It's not only in the last 20 years, ever since the West kind of became familiar with critical Kashmir studies, because many Kashmiri scholars got together and activists got together and they wanted to carve a niche for it, because Kashmir was not seen as a region. It was seen as a region, but again, unhighlighted by bigger nationalisms. So, but Kashmiris have written for the last 74 years. They've actually looked at their situation, but most of them have not been able to be translated to the other parts of the world. And also many of them were criminalized. They were completely repressed. And that's where you can create solidarity, which is to understand Kashmir through the vantage of Kashmiris, not through the vantage of what other analysts tell you. There are Kashmiris used to, for the longest possible time, and even today, feel like, again, for lack of a better analogy, as guinea pigs, because people come to them and they say, like, what do you want? What do Kashmiris want? And it's an affront to people who have been 100,000 people, and many official documents, many human rights documents kind of put it around 70,000 to 100,000 people have been killed, both combatants and non-combatants. How is it that combatants in Kashmir today can be killed and labeled as terrorists? And these are 15-year-old ill-trained boys who don't have arms and ammunition. How is it that India can have this level of war crimes inside Kashmir and Indians be silent because they have bought the fact that Kashmiris are doing something fundamentally that's affecting their sovereignty? But that's a complete lie. The fact is that Kashmir's sovereignty has been attacked. In 2019, what Indians took was Kashmir's sovereignty. And that was the re-annexation of Kashmir. It wasn't the annexation for first time, because the first annexation happens in 1947. For lack of a better milestone, it happened even before. But 2019 it kind of like came full circle. Nehru, whom we kind of think of, a lot of people still think of him as a very benign, a socialist, whatever he might have been in his time and whatever his good things or bad things, but he called Israel a fact in 1957, in the 1950s itself. And he called for the abrogation of Kashmir's autonomy, having signed it with the rest of the people in 1950s itself. So isn't it important for Indians who are thinking about this and who are also looking at their own country as really sinking? And it's almost like the imperial heart of India is really brazenly evident now. There is nothing to hide it. So isn't it a moment for those people who still want to understand Kashmir to look at Kashmir's history? Like, what are Kashmiris thinking? What are Kashmiris asking? Rather than what the government is telling them? And in 2019, the Indian government said that we are actually developing Kashmir. We are rooting out terrorism and nepotism. And we are also, they also made it seem that Kashmir's autonomy had created a virulent system where it was not only repressing Kashmiris and taking away democratic rights from them, but it was also discriminating against women. And it was very easy to buy, because it's very easy to buy that this is a Muslim-dominated region. So women can be oppressed, women must be oppressed because this must be a very sad patriarchy. People still ask me, like, where is my burqa? People still ask me, how is it that I speak good English? And that's not just that's a lot of post-colonial Malays around it, but it's also a very specific kind of Malays for Kashmiris, because we are seen as a certain way. And so I would say, long story short, I would say that the best is to read Kashmiri writers and see what they're writing for what it is. And the other thing that I will say is that in this moment, a lot of Kashmiri writers in Kashmir have stopped writing, because no one can write in Kashmir at this moment. Anyone who is writing something is seen as secession. It's not seen as dissent. That is what's the juice of democracy, but it's seen as, everything is seen as attacking India's sovereignty and throwing people into the jail. So at this moment, when we are thinking about the future of Kashmir, you see a lot of Kashmiri voices ebbing, but there is still a lot that you can read, that you can contend with, and ask questions about, which will show you that Kashmiri movement is a resistance. It's not terrorism, so to speak. And that's where Indians kind of also divest from Kashmiri resistance, thinking that it's attacking their geo-body, without paying attention to the fact that it is their nation state that is killing them and highlighting their identity, and maligning and undermining their resistance. So they're not thinking the other way around. They're thinking of themselves as victims. So I think that mentality needs to change.
I think there's a kind of follow-on. I'm being just conscious of time, so there's quite a few questions. You were saying about people reading Kashmiri authors, and so one of the questions is, who would you recommend? Which authors would you recommend, apart from yourself, of course, in terms of providing a kind of blueprint?
I would say there's a lot of Kashmiri fiction that has there's fiction that has been published, which is a good way to get into Kashmiri writing. I would say Mirza Waheed, Basharat Peer, Farah Bashir. Farah Bashir's is not it's a non-fiction memoiristic piece. And then there is Gauhar Gilani. There are many other authors who have written fiction and non-fiction, and there is academic work that has been produced on Kashmir. You can just Google Critical Kashmir Studies. You can Google Resisting Occupation. There is this one volume where you have a lot of Kashmiri scholars who got together, and there's this. It's a reader in itself. Like you can kind of look at the basic 101 situation that is in Kashmir. So I can provide a list to the organizers and they can move it forward. So that's not a problem. And you can also look at the website of Stand with Kashmir. They have a voluminous in progress syllabus where they have put a lot of effort into. There's a lot of writers in there, and not just Kashmiris, but also non-Kashmiris who have written regarding Kashmir. Then there is another website, which is Kashmiri Scholars Advocacy Network. They also have a lot of documents on their website. I'm connected to most of the things that I'm talking about here. So they have a lot of documents on their website as well that you can read, and that take you to different kind of collections or authors, artists, and they also have some 101 documents on their website that help you understand Kashmiri situation from the Kashmiri vantage. And that's also a group of Kashmiri and non-Kashmiri scholars who work on Kashmir. So I would suggest I can, after the talk, I can send the list to the organizers and they can send it to you and to others who are interested.
Right. Thanks. And sort of switching from the more practical, Mariam Mushtaq, who may be someone I know, is asking a question. Can you elaborate on post-colonialism, forgetting Kashmiris and Palestinians?
I think the answer is very, I'll make it short in the interest of time. when we think of post-colonialism, it's almost like in the last 50 years, the way it's kind of like grown, it's also the subaltern school of thought, where you kind of like, can the subaltern speak? And you think about imperialism versus brown bodies. You think about the imposition of Western Eurocentric biased perspective on peoples in the non-West, quote unquote, also the Orient or the East. So that's kind of largely how we see the school of post-colonialism, and also thinking about the subaltern study and how it kind of came to fruition, especially in the South Asian context. So my only, I think the question is here, and I just want to quickly look at it so that I'm not, where did the question go? Forgetting Kashmiris and Palestinians. So my question is really simple. It's like, in all of this post-colonial literature, have you ever seen the mention of Kashmir as Kashmir emerges right now in the psyche of people and after the re-internationalization of 2019? Have we ever seen anyone talk about Kashmir in the manner Kashmiris want it to be spoken of? If post-colonialism hasn't done that, isn't that a disservice? It has hidden more about the post-colonial nations, especially when we think about India. It has hidden so much about India. Kashmir is not the only problem with India. And again, for the lack of a better term, the northeastern states. Long before AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, was imposed in Kashmir in 1991, it was already imposed in the northeastern states, especially Assam. So, and also thinking about what's happening in the areas like Bastar and the indigenous people inside Kashmir, and who is imposing on them. In indigenous people inside India, sorry. So you kind of think about like, what kind of world did the post-colonial scholars live in when they are thinking about, also thinking about the subaltern? I kind of think that if Kashmir was not presented in the manner by the post-colonial scholars as Kashmir exists now, I don't think post-colonialism serves us. And that's kind of the invisibilization. And that happens to Palestinian issue as well. It's not seen in the same manner. And many scholars in this moment, especially people who subscribe to the post-colonial school of thought, they're thinking about, is Kashmir an internal occupation issue? And again, that's an affront to Kashmiri history. How can post-colonial scholars think about post-colonialism and then Kashmir as an internal occupation issue? Isn't that really, isn't that kind of like even erasing what post-colonialism thinks about in its basic premise? And then thinking about democracy, the Westphalian Eurocentric democracy that comes to our cultures and tries to tame the cultures. And I'm not saying democracy is bad in a sense, but then also thinking about the kind of violences it has created on people, people like us, cultures and ethnicities, and the way it's really tried to carve borders. And then, you know, even thinking about when we think about partition of India, the language, when we say partition of India, the partition means that you are partitioning something that is a continuous legacy of some kind of antiquity, but that's not true. You're actually creating two separate countries from an entity that was put together by the British colonials. So all of those, I think these are invisibilizations. So rather than like partition is creation, creation serves me better, because when we say creation of two countries, it really helps me see Kashmir as well. But I don't think those questions have been head-on asked or even asked in post-colonial theory in that sense. It's been so much of thinking about imperialism on brown bodies, and in that there are some predominant brown bodies, for lack of a, you know, again, not, it might look like a generalization, but upper class brown bodies in that sense, the Indian brown bodies for that sense. And Kashmiris don't exist in that equation at all. And we don't see them mentioned. We don't see Kashmiris have been from the word get-go criminalized. From 1915 itself, Kashmiris have been criminalized. And it's only the epitome of that criminalization that we see now, because now the world buys the word terrorist very easily, and then you become one if you're a Muslim too. So I think those are the questions we need to ask. And that's the kind of invisibilization that has happened.
There's another question. What do you consider to be the ushering of neocolonialism in Kashmir? The August 5th, 2019, which for our non-South Asian audience is the point at which the Indian state abrogated on the constitutional status that Kashmir had since 1947. So that's the first part of the question, is about the ushering of neocolonialism. And the second part of the question, which is quite a different question, but I'll pose it just because I think it's one person. For an indigenous researcher studying Indian occupation of Kashmir, how does one move beyond the post-colonial methodology? They're two separate questions, actually. So I don't know, maybe, should I read the first one out again? It's about the ushering.
I got it. I actually tried to access it said, what do you consider to be ushering of neocolonialism in Kashmir? I think, what do you consider to be ushering of neocolonialism in Kashmir? I think everything, right from the get-go. It's when we think about post-colonial societies or post-colonial countries, so to speak, I feel like if we go to their inception, as they kind of come into formation, like India comes into formation, and I'll kind of think about India and vis-a-vis Kashmir, that's also like, it's also creating a lot of violence on other people, which it wants to get into its borders. So I think that moment is very important for us to consider. Like, it's not a very comfortable situation. It takes it takes India 70 years to to abrogate or deoperationalize Kashmir's autonomy, almost 70 years. And it's a long time. It should make us think that from its very inception, when the client politicians signed the autonomy agreement, and they kind of were keeping plebiscite on the table as well, and they were saying that we are going to be this entity till we kind of find a resolution. I think that's also part and parcel of how this neocolonialism works, which is why I had earlier said that India has its own brand of neocolonialism. So the way Westphalian Eurocentric democracies come to these post-colonial states, they kind of give them the infrastructure and then they take off on their own. And in this moment, what you see is the flowering of ethno-nationalism, the flowering of Hindu supremacy that is at its epitome. And in this moment, you kind of see neocolonialism, neoliberalism, and that kind of mesh together and kind of coalesce to form this new entity that we are facing. On one hand, there is this question of development in Kashmir that in 2019 was used as one of the crowbars to pry into Kashmir, that we're going to develop Kashmir. You know, Kashmir isn't developed, which was really a misnomer, which was really a straw man argument were used around Kashmir, that it has to be developed and women are discriminated against, and we have to set that right, and we have to take away Kashmir's autonomy. You see that as a new neocolonial moment. So I don't see 2019 as any break from the larger policy that India has had for Kashmir, because the policy starts with Nehru himself. Nehru actually saw this autonomy being diluted and going away with time. So he was never, he and his ilk, they were never very genuine about giving Kashmir autonomy. They always saw it something that is going to go away at some point. But I think in what Nehru probably saw was Kashmiris kind of like, you know, gelling with India and integrating with India. But Kashmiris never did that. And I feel like a post-colonial, someone who was, you know, so pivotal to India's own independence and thinking about their own ethnicity and thinking about their own identity, how could they be so blind to other people? And I think that's something that's something that when we think about Indian neocolonialism, it is a different animal altogether. But for Kashmiris, it has been very brazen. If you look from the Kashmiri vantage from 1947 itself, it has been neocolonialism. And let me give you one little example. How colonialism, in its neocolonial fashion, the way we see it emerge in so many places, especially Kashmir, you see it, you see what India has also used democracy as, like weaponization of democracy, weaponization of electoral politics, telling people that, you know, you are the fate of your, you are the master of your own fate. But in reality, they're not, because they are imposing a system on them and then trying to make it down the line, make it palatable to people. At one point, there was this question asked, like, if you're, and it's still asked, like, if you're taking part in Indian elections, how are you subscribing to the politics of Azadi? Aren't they two different things? And there was this idea propagated that Kashmiris don't know what they want. They're such a fragmented society. Some want Pakistan, some want India, and some are wanting independence. And then the other idea that was floated, that is still being floated, that different ethnicities, you know, there are Kashmiris, then there are Pahadis, and then you have the Azad Kashmiris, and, you know, this region is so disparate, and there are Buddhists, and then there are Hindus, and then there are Pandits, indigenous Brahmins who are called the Pandits, and then of course now they kind of like go under the rubric of Hindus, which they did not before. They saw themselves as a distinct ethnic identity. So that is kind of like propagated as a fragmentation of this place. But I think the question that we need to ask also is, how is it that India sees itself as a unity in diversity, but when it comes to Kashmiris, why is their diversity seen as fragmentation? So these are questions of narratives. So you see India's neocolonialism, the way it's kind of like propagating based on a democratic, Eurocentric democratic system that is also imposed on its geobody. And you see the discomfort that it has with it, as we see it unfolding in India. But then in Kashmir, it unfolds in a more sinister manner, because on one hand, they make Kashmiris, if you're not taking part in voting, you're not a Democrat. And it's not a good thing if you're not a democratic person, if you don't subscribe to democracy. I see that as a sinister way of taming people through a Westphalian superstructure that has been imposed on them. But on the other side, India also weaponizes it. It says once Kashmiris take part in electoral system, that's a blanket endorsement of Indian rule over them. But that's not true. Kashmiris see the politics of Azadi as separate, but they do, over the years, they also want to live. They want to have some form of governance. They want to have the shelter, food, water kind of a thing. But then also Indian neocolonialism, it's also been very extractive. It's not only in 2019 that they took away the territorial sovereignty and now they're coming in, and now settler colonialism is going to happen exactly as it's happening in Palestine, or as it has happened in Palestine in the last 72 years. In Kashmir, it has also happened, but it's just happened under the garb of democracy or a democratic system. Think about Kashmir's water resources. Kashmiris, there were Kashmiri civil society leaders who are fighting to get back their national water resources that are under hydroelectric and thermal dams, all these hydroelectric projects that have been created inside Kashmir over Kashmiri water bodies. And that take most of the electricity to India. So what had happened in the 2000s, there was these big movements that were created by Kashmiris to get back those water resources, to not have India nationalize, so to speak, those water resources, and they be under Kashmiri control. And Kashmiris were saying that it's a new East India Company. So there were various narratives going on in the last 72 years within the Kashmiri society in different manners, some fighting for resources, some fighting for, for more political rights, and some fighting for self-determination. So it's a confluence that you have to see as part of the same problem, which is the problem of right to exist and right to self-determination. It's not just one thing. So that's how Indian neocolonialism has also kind of weaponized democracy to invisibilize Kashmiri situation. I feel like that's one of the foremost lenses that we should be using to understand Indian neocolonialism. I don't know what the second part was, I forget.
The second part was about, for an indigenous researcher studying Indian occupation of Kashmir, how does one move beyond the post-colonial methodology? And actually that ties in with a question that we have, the last question. I think this is by Miriam Davis, where she says, I'm curious to hear about the silencing of Kashmir by post-colonial studies and how this plays out or possibly rectified in decolonial approaches, as well as current discourses around the indigenous? So I suppose they're kind of similar questions in some way. What's your kind of methodology from this point?
I think in this moment, whenever I talk to students or people who I mentor in different ways, degrees, by conversations, or being formally connected to their projects, I feel like rather than I mean, of course, we need to look at post-colonialism and the school of thought and subaltern school of thought and kind of see and deconstruct whatever for its merits and demerits. But I also think that in this moment, I encourage myself and my students and anyone who is really interested in understanding how is it that we move forward. We do have to contend, and we have to start understanding decolonial literature. We have to engage with decolonial literature, and not just decolonial literature that is we don't have a lot around Kashmir at this moment, which is decolonial. Of course, Critical Kashmir Studies, the premise is decolonial, and we are kind of learning from other indigenous scholars and other indigenous scholarship that has been produced. So I think in this moment, that is what needs to be happening. But to how do you make a line, a smaller line? You draw a bigger line. And I think decolonization of knowledge is the bigger line where you can begin from. That's how you want to move past, because I see a lot of people still taken up by thinking about post-colonial. I feel like, what is post-colonial for Kashmir? There is no post-colonial for Kashmir. It's all neocolonialism. It's all neocolonialism. There is no post to the conflict. There is no post-conflict in our societies, in our cultures. So that's something that we need to understand, that this is the moment, not just to understand what's being missed by post-colonialism and how it has invisibilized our situations, but what does decolonization do for us, and how do we do decolonization? I think that's very important for us to understand. And we don't have to do decolonization like other indigenous people are doing. That's where we also have to start thinking about boundaries, thinking about not collating and thinking that my struggle is just like other people's struggles. Therefore, what they are saying against their hegemons is what I can do against my hegemons. I think we are dealing with different beasts, but really created by this post-colonial Westphalian Eurocentric democracy that we have taken into our societies, and now we're grappling with it. And I think we also have to think about, I think you should engage with the settler democracy in US and how it has been so successful in talking about itself as the leading democracy while invisibilizing an entire genocide that we sit upon as we join the layers of colonists settlers who have come in. So I think decolonization is the only way. Decolonizing knowledges, and I would say, for Kashmir, go back to your writers. They might have written in Kashmiri, they might have written in Urdu, but they have written, and they have written in English as well. And I know that it's the bane of post-colonial societies, again, for lack of a better word, that we have to learn English so that we can talk to the rest of the world, because that's how ideas get across. But think about Gugi Wathiyango. Think about decolonizing the mind. I think that is somewhere, maybe a place to begin with. And also think about how he resurrects his own language in different forms and different manners, and how he also carries English with him. So maybe I just dropped the name for some, but he's a preeminent sort of like the father of decolonizing the mind. That's a book that he's also written, and the historian of African literature. So I think that's where I began my decolonizing the mind journey. And that's probably where, if you are looking towards it, that might be a place to begin with. And then there are many other decolonial scholars who you probably, again, I can send the list to the organizers, but you have to look towards decolonial literature, decolonizing your mindset, and trying to understand your own scholars who have written for the last 70 years. And I say 70 years because post-1947, all of these issues emerge and also become very vague and become removed from their history. Kashmir is so removed from its history in this moment that even my generation had to go back and read history on our own so that we know why we are in the problem that we are. Otherwise, everyone was telling us in the early 90s that Kashmir was so peaceful. What happened? It used to be in the Bollywood movies, and why? What happened to Kashmiris? Why? And then the problem was like, it had been diluted so much that the absence of direct military aggression on the roads was seen as peace. So it was absence of that. And here's the thing, when we think about the direct military aggression, the absence of it on roads, it was not really true. It was always there with the encampments and the bases and the military bases and the military camps that had been set across Kashmir. If you take all of them together, they're the size of Dallas, Texas. That's the level of the Indian military, the length of the breadth of Kashmir that they are occupying at this moment is the size of Dallas. So that was always true for Kashmiris, and people were still saying that there is peace. There was films being picturized inside Kashmir. There was a lot of fetishization of Kashmiris, and which we also saw happening in 2019. So it had always been happening, and I think the moment for us is to understand all of that and kind of like not just think about what disservice post-colonialism has done. Of course, if you want to take that up as your topic and want to look into it, you're welcome. But I think just to move beyond, you also have to think about decolonization. You have to think about decolonialism, decolonizing 101, and how to incorporate that into your project and to how you're thinking. And for that, you will have to go back to people who have written about Kashmir, who are Kashmiris, and across communities, whatever they have written, pay attention to it. Whatever they're writing, pay attention to it. And then look up other indigenous scholars and decolonial scholars and see how they are framing questions and how they're asking questions of the settlers. And I think there's some learning to be done there as well. So I think that's the only way, rather than just picking holes in post-colonialism. Let's construct something, because I think the world is really ready to hear. I might be too much of a positive person here, but I think I feel that. I feel like we are at a threshold where people are ready to listen to other alternate ideas, because it's not just us as indigenous communities, as Kashmiris, as Palestinians who are under threat. I think the entire world is dealing with some of the problems that we have in different manners. It's only a matter of thinking through them to see how we are actually being eaten alive by the Westphalian Eurocentric democracy, and that we subscribe to so easily.
I'm conscious of time, and so I'm just thinking, do you want to take a few more, or should we? There's one. I mean, the question is from Naeem Malik, and it's kind of a practical question. So if we take that and then think about where we're going in terms of time. We've been going for about an hour. Yeah, I mean, it's up to you. So let me do this question, is that we know what we are asking for in Palestine as a demand of the BDS movement, i.e. equal rights, dismantling of apartheid Israel, and right return for the Palestinians. What's the kind of demands for people like yourself, for ourselves, or people who who are sitting outside of South Asia? What kind of solidarity demands do you think are appropriate, or are there any kind of campaigns, I suppose, is what I'm also like civil society campaigns like BDS that are in place for people who are listening that might want to know how to practically get involved? So I suppose there's two things. What do you see as the roadmap, and what's the organizational side to that?
So I think Kashmiris have had to, in the last 74 years, they've had to contend with layers of invisibilization, and they have had to really for Palestine, sometimes it's also like it's also very kind of direct kind of a fight, even though they are fighting so many perceptions and biases and so much invisibilization in different forms. But Kashmiris have had to fight democracy itself, the politics of democracy, to tell the rest of the world, hey, we are genuine. We are a genuine problem. We are not terrorism. We are not disgruntled. We are not disenchanted. It's not as if we are disenchanted and we have distrust of India. It's actually, we have a problem. So how does the world give Kashmir solidarity in this moment? And I feel like, and what do Kashmiris want? I feel Kashmiris want the right to self-determination. And it's not just the plebiscite, the theory of plebiscite, you either join one country or the other. I think that the area needs to be demilitarized. it's so heavily militarized at the moment that it's one of the highest militarized zones in the world. There is 1 soldier for every 8 Kashmiris. It varies in some places, 1 soldier for every 17, because there are no clear-cut statistics regarding how many soldiers are inside Kashmir, but it's more than 700,000, and it's kind of growing day by day. And they're also taking over more and more land. So I think demilitarization of the region really is something that we can all put our weight behind, and decolonization of the region, and also thinking about how to resurrect the right for self-determination of Kashmiris and what that would look like, asking Kashmiris themselves. And again, I'm saying we don't have to go back to 19th century and 20th century resolutions for a 21st century problem. And it is a 21st century problem right now. And Kashmir also is a very generative place to think about ethnicities and identities, and how people, like Kashmiri is a certain identity, but then there are other identities in there. And that India uses, as I said earlier, it says that there is a lot of diversity, there's a lot of fragmentation, but that's not really fragmentation. India got to the point where it is now, to its unity, diversity kind of a situation. It was in negotiation with different parts of what is now India before 1947, just to think like what the country would look like. They took more than 10 years to think that. How is it that they're asking Kashmiris this question and they should have this while they're under siege? So I think the area needs a breather. We really, as international community, people need to say that this area needs to be demilitarized. It needs to be decolonized. It needs a rest for some time so that people can breathe and live and have political freedoms, whatever that is going to look like. And it's a very creative situation. I don't think I don't think we can subscribe to 19th or 20th century solutions to a 21st century problem where people are actually, we are also so much connected to other indigenous struggles, not by geolocations, but because we see them as similar. Just thinking about the Palestinian situation, how Kashmiris see themselves in what I call as affective solidarity. Like there is no exchange as such, but there is so much affect in between these two struggles that people actually in Friday congregations, that used to be the norm, to pray for Palestine. And wherever you saw free Kashmir, you saw free Palestine, free save Gaza. And it's very unique to Kashmir that when something happens in Palestine, that there is a protest in Kashmir, that people will come onto the streets. In 2014, there was a young boy who was killed by the Indian forces because of a protest that was being done for Palestine. So what I kind of think is that there is a simultaneous kind of situation happening between these indigenous peoples all across the world, and preeminent might be in this conversation. I'm saying Palestine and Kashmiris, and I think those solidarities need to be kept in mind, and we have to think creatively. We don't really, predominantly when we think about United Nations, predominantly when we think about West trying to solve these problems, we also have to think about West having created these problems, especially when we think about United Kingdom, and also thinking about the role what the US is playing in this moment. So I think I veered a little too far from the question, but I think that's where I am. Did I answer it?
No, I think that was, I think it's just quite important to think about how we can do solidarity work when we're sitting outside of the context. I mean, and the international profile of Palestine is very high, and has been much higher than the international profile of Kashmir, because, as you said, of the Kashmiri of the Indian state, and so I think that was the main thrust of the question, was about how we can do, what is the kind of Kashmiri civil society.
There's an important point that I want to add, that in this moment, the level of criminalization of Kashmiri resistance has reached to a point where no one can speak for Kashmir. Inside Kashmir, people are taking great risks to write, to read, to research, to come out. But there is so much happening as we are sitting here after 2019. so many laws have been changed inside Kashmir without any kind of negotiation with Kashmiris. It's all been unilateral. It's all been the Indian rule and their nominated government, which is not elected or anything. They're directly ruling it from New Delhi, and they're changing laws every day. As a result, one of the preeminent human rights defenders who's recognized, who works with the United Nations, you have Khurram Parvez. He's under arrest. He's been incarcerated since November last. You have journalists. You have a journalist who runs a very, it's a very famous and reputed website called Kashmir Wala, and it's also in print. He's also under arrest. There is Asif Sultan. He has been under arrest since 2016. You have so many journalists who have actually done their due, which as journalists they do. They just report on things. They have been put into jails because they have aided and abetted either some sort of a secessionism, or they are labeled outrightly as terrorists. That's what's happening. And again, as when we think about Khurram Parvez, the kind of work he was doing is also seen as a threat to India's sovereignty, which is just, documenting human rights. And also historically speaking of why, because human rights, when we think about human rights, it's not, and that's the other thing, when we think about solidarity, like what kind of solidarity do Kashmiris need? There are a lot of people who give solidarity for ameliorating human rights issues. They're like, oh yeah, definitely there should be no human rights violations. But human rights violations don't occur in a vacuum. They occur because Kashmiris are asking for something. So human rights violations are occurring because India doesn't want Kashmiris to be in resistance against their rule. They don't want Kashmiris to have right to self-determination. So when Kashmiris are asking their right to self-determination, they get violated, their human rights get violated. And since 1991, we have seen an outright disrespect of life and property and privacy inside Kashmir. None of them exist. So I think that's something that we also need to consider, that Kashmiris don't need solidarity only to ameliorate human rights violations. They need to ameliorate what is causing those human rights violations. And that is the political solution to the problem. And I think, so that's kind of like, we have to look at the overlaps in solidarity that indigenous people can give each other. And I think from 2019 onwards, and even after 1947, you have this really extractive neocolonial rule and occupation and military occupation that's imposed on Kashmir, that's taking its resources away. And that's leaving this region as a soup bowl, which is inundated the moment there are floods, because the kind of burden on this little geo body, which is so much, there's so much military in the region. There are so many military installations in the region. It's not that big of a place to hold its own 8 million people plus the military and plus whatever other allied formations it has. So it's becoming an ecological disaster as well. And I think, and the other bigger point is that it's a nuclear flashpoint. So there are so many overlaps that the world community can see, where it doesn't only serve the Kashmiris, but where it's serving the world community and the community in South Asia. So, and also, I would say I would really urge people not to buy the rubric of Islamic terrorism, which is such a misnomer and such a stereotypical entity, and it's easily imposed on Kashmiris. And that's why Kashmiris many times subscribe to United Nations, because they say, oh, we are recognized by United Nations, not because they think United Nations is the end all and be all. They think it's a shorthand for the world to understand that we are a genuine resistance and we are not terrorism, so to speak. So I think those are the overlaps where we can kind of meet as these different struggles, but at the same time, we don't really have to subscribe to 19th and 20th century solutions for 21st century problems, even if they are historical, because the world has changed, people have changed, and we can be more creative in combating the scourge of what is post-colonialism.
I think, Ather, if you're okay, we can end there. I think you actually answered another question, which is about the idea of eliminating the idea of terrorism in terms of the way in which we think and see Kashmir. In fact, you just answered that just now. And I'm just conscious of the time, so I'd like to thank you for this talk. I think it's been a wonderful kind of contribution to this series of talks in which we're looking at this relationship between India and Israel, and the ways and the different ways in which these two actual entities that profess democracy, as you were saying, but are engaged in real violent acts against people within these territories. So yeah, thank you.
I do want to say this because maybe we needed more direct connection. I do want to say the connection between India and Israel. A lot of people think that it's a very recent thing, that they're warming up, but I would also urge them to look into the history of how Nehru or even how Gandhi saw this. So I think there is something there, because Nehru in 1950 said that Israel is a fact, and they allowed a consulate in Mumbai in 1950s, and in 1990 is when the first embassy opens, and then that becomes the consulate general in Mumbai. So and currently we do pay a lot of attention to the trade happening between the two countries, especially the agribusiness, and also thinking about arms and ammunition. But I think we also have to pay attention to what else is happening regarding cultural trade, films, and little businesses and tourism. And I think that is far more problematic than having a brazen arms trade happening between the two, which is so that's something that is happening in the moment. So I feel like that's kind of the new level and layer that's being added. So that's what I would say regarding that. And Kashmiris have seen the Israeli settler colonial states' incursions into Kashmir in the 80s and even before. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I'm hoping that someone actually brings that together and writes about it in a more formal manner, so that we have something to go back to, because these things can get very diluted and then completely forgotten. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And I also wanted to bring your attention to what Modi said in 2017 when he was visiting, and their mic was left open, and where he said that, oh, I have to take care of interests of India. I need more water, clean water. Where will I get it? Ramallah? So that's something that kind of also shows how close, I mean, of course, closeness, but it also shows where the interests lie and how they are being portrayed. And of course, the ideological consonance that is between Hindutva and Zionism. But I would urge people to think about Hindutva being its own animal and beast, rather than sort of like deriving from Zionism here and there. It's far more deep-rooted and far more, I would say, like different than Zionism. So that's something to consider while we are kind of looking at similarities and comparing things.
We will be, the cultural part, I think, is really important. It is one of the contemporary changes that we've seen, and we are hoping to have a full session of that. One of these talks will be looking at those kind of those more micro links, if you like, in the way in which you see a much more of a kind of soft version, whereas obviously, I suppose, when we're talking in terms of these kinds of highly militarized zones, it's quite important also to recognize the other side to the military occupation. So yeah, I'd like to again just thank you, and to thank the Institute of Palestine Studies, and for those who've joined us. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.